you were born lucky. You probably don't feel that way on a Monday morning, stuck in traffic, staring at a cold cup of coffee, but you are, because there were moments in human history so catastrophic, so total, so absolutely crushing, that if you had been born, then there is a very real chance you would never have survived your first winter. Not because of war, not because of famine, but because the entire world was trying to kill your species. And it almost worked. This is the story of the worst times in history to be born as a human. And by the end of it, you'll look at your ordinary life in a completely different way. Let's start somewhere uncomfortable. Around 70,000 years ago, your ancestors almost went extinct. Not almost as in things were rough, almost as in the total number of breeding humans on Earth may have dropped to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. That's it. That's everyone. That's fewer people than can fit in a mid-sized concert hall. Geneticist Lynn Jordy at the University of Utah studied the diversity in modern human DNA and found a bottleneck so severe it suggests our species came terrifyingly close to the end. The culprit, a supervolcano. Mount Toba, in what is now Sumatra, erupted with a force roughly 5,000 times greater than the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. It sent so much ash into the atmosphere that scientists believe it triggered a volcanic winter lasting years, possibly a decade. Temperatures dropped. Crops, if you could even call the plants early humans depended on crops, disappeared. Animals migrated or died. The world went cold and dark and silent. If you had been born in the years following that eruption, you would have entered a planet that had forgotten how to support human life. Your first breath would have come in a world already mourning its own survival. But Toba was not a single moment. It was a threshold, and history is full of thresholds. Times when the universe seemed to draw a breath and decide maybe not yet. Move forward to roughly 1200 BCE. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. And if you had been born during or just before it, you would have watched one of the most advanced civilizations in the ancient world simply stop. The Mycenaeans, gone. The Hittites, gone. The great palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed within a generation. Archaeologist Eric Klein at George Washington University spent years studying this period and concluded that it was not a single cause, but a perfect storm, drought, earthquake, internal rebellion, disrupted trade routes, and the mysterious appearance of the Sea People's raiders who moved through the Mediterranean like fire through dry grass. In a span of roughly 50 years, literacy rates in Greece dropped so severely that writing itself largely disappeared from the region for centuries. If you had been born around 1180 BCE in what is now Greece or Turkey, you would likely have spent your childhood watching everything your grandparents built turn to rubble. There would be no palace to protect you, no trade route to bring food, no system to hold the world together, just survival, raw, brutal, daily survival. And yet humans survived. They always do. Something in your ancestors refused to give up. That refusal is written into your biology. Now come forward again to 541 CE, the plague of Justinian. The world's first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague swept through the Byzantine Empire and beyond, killing, by some estimates from historian William Rosen, as many as 25 to 50 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. That was roughly half the population of the known world at the time. If you had been born in Constantinople in 540 CE, you would have grown up in one of the most magnificent cities on Earth, running water. Marble streets, a dome so large the engineers who built it weren't sure it would stand. And then, within a year, the streets would have filled with bodies. Emperor Justinian himself caught the plague and survived barely. At the height of the outbreak, Constantinople was reportedly losing 5,000 to 10,000 people per day. There weren't enough living people to bury the dead. Your childhood home would have smelled of death from every direction. Your parents, your neighbors, your teachers, all of them potentially gone within months. The city that was supposed to be eternal was learning it was not, but even that was not the worst. Not yet. Let's talk about 536 CE, just a few years before Justinian's plague. Medieval historian Michael McCormick of Harvard University has called it the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year to be alive in human history. In 536, a massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, sent a fog of ash across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. For 18 months, the sun dimmed. Temperatures in Europe dropped by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. Summer never came. Crops failed across the continent. Snow fell in China in August. Drought hit Peru. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote at the time that the sun gave no more light than the moon, and that the year looked like it had no seasons. If you had been born in 536 CE, your first years of life would have passed in a world where warmth was just a memory. The famine that followed killed an unknown number of people. And then 10 years later, when the world was already weakened and starved, Justinian's plague arrived to finish the job. Picture that for a moment. You are born into a dim, cold world. Your family is hungry. The harvests have failed for years. And then a plague arrives. You do not know what a bacterium is. You do not understand how disease spreads. You only know that the people around you are dying and that you have no way to stop it. Now move forward to 1347, the Black Death. You already know the name, but knowing the name doesn't prepare you for the scale. Between 1347 and 1351, bubonic plague killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population. In some regions, it was worse. Florence lost roughly 60% of its citizens. Some villages in France and England simply ceased to exist. Historian Ole Benedicto at the University of Oslo spent decades compiling mortality records and concluded that the true death toll across Eurasia may have reached 200 million people. If you had been born in Europe in 1340, you would have reached adulthood in a world where every road smelled of burning bodies, where the church, the institution that was supposed to explain suffering, had no answers, where the wealthiest and the poorest died equally and randomly, and where children buried their parents and then were buried by no one at all. The psychological damage alone was staggering. Survivors described a world that had lost its meaning. Why work the land? Why build a home? Why fall in love? The future seemed like a joke, and yet, art came out of it. Literature came out of it. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron inside a plague. Survivors, perhaps for the first time, began questioning inherited authority. Some historians argue that the Black Death cracked open the rigid social structure of medieval Europe and helped plant the seeds of the Renaissance. Suffering, it turns out, sometimes burns down the old world to make room for a new one. But that is cold comfort if you are the one who did not survive. Move now to the early 1600s. You are born into the Americas, not Europe. Specifically, you are born somewhere in the vast, complex, deeply civilized world that already existed here before European contact. The population of the Americas in 1491 is still debated by scholars, but historian Charles Mann in his landmark work 1491 draws on research suggesting the number may have been as high as 100 million people, more than the entire population of Europe at the time. There were cities larger than London. There were agricultural systems feeding millions. There were trade networks stretching thousands of miles. And then, within a century of European contact, it is estimated that 90% of that population was gone. Not from warfare alone, primarily from disease. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza moved through the Americas like an unstoppable wave, targeting populations that had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. If you had been born into any indigenous community anywhere in the Americas between 1500 and 1700, you would have lived through a catastrophe with no precedent in human memory. You would have watched your elders, your knowledge keepers, your healers die first because they were the ones who went to comfort the sick. The oral history, the medicinal knowledge, the astronomical expertise, all of it disappearing with the people who carried it. You would have been a child in a world being erased in real time. This is not a distant abstraction. This is the lived experience of millions of real human beings. And then there is the 20th century, which deserves its own moment of silence before we enter it. If you had been born in Europe in 1900, you would have been told you were living in the most civilized era in human history. By 1918, you would have watched 20 million people die in the First World War. Before you turned 25, the Spanish flu would arrive and kill another 50 to 100 million people globally, more than the war itself. Before you turned 40, you would be in another world war. And this time, the weapons were different. The goals were different. By 1945, 70 to 85 million people had died. Cities had been turned to dust, and then the atomic bomb dropped over Hiroshima, and the world learned something new about what humans were capable of doing to each other. Historian Yuval Noah Harari has noted that we tend to remember the 20th century for its triumphs, its medicine, its technology, its art. But if you lived through the first half of it, your experience was one of almost continuous catastrophe. Born in 1900, you were old enough by 1950 to have personally witnessed 2 world wars, a global pandemic, the Holocaust, and the invention of a weapon capable of ending all human life. You would be forgiven for finding it hard to feel hopeful. But here's the twist. Here's the thing that sits underneath all of this, the fact that makes your existence right now genuinely remarkable. You are descended from every single one of those survivors. Every catastrophe described in this video, the Toba eruption, the Bronze Age collapse, the plague of Justinian, the Black Death, the devastation of the Americas, the world wars, your ancestors were present for all of it. Not as passive victims, as survivors. As people who found food when there was no food, who built shelter when there was no shelter, who held on to each other in the dark when the only reasonable thing to do was let go. Anthropologist Joseph Henrich at Harvard has written extensively about how humans survive not because of individual intelligence, but because of what he calls collective intelligence, the accumulated knowledge of the group passed down through culture, ritual, story, and practice. Every time a catastrophe wiped out most of a population, the survivors carried something forward, a technique for finding food in a dead winter, a way of treating a wound, a story about what happened and how they got through it. And they gave it to their children, who gave it to their children, who eventually gave it to you. Your body itself carries the evidence. Biologist David Reich at Harvard Medical School has mapped the genetic signatures of ancient population events in modern human DNA. The Toba bottleneck, the migrations after the Bronze Age collapse, the genetic shifts after plague years. All of it is written in you at the molecular level, like a diary kept not in words, but in proteins and chromosomes. You are not just the heir to history. You are its archive. So what does this mean for you sitting here now? It means that your ordinary Tuesday contains something extraordinary inside it. The fact that you are breathing, thinking, reading, existing. It is the result of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back through ice ages and plagues and collapses and wars. Every ancestor you have ever had lived long enough to have a child. Every single one. Not one of them gave up at the moment when giving up would have been the most rational choice. James C. Scott, the political scientist at Yale, wrote about how pre-modern people lived in a constant state of what he called vulnerability, exposed to forces entirely beyond their control. A bad harvest, a disease, a drought, an invader. Any of these could erase a community overnight. Modern life has not removed vulnerability, but it has placed so many layers of protection between you and the raw edge of the world that you have largely forgotten the edge exists. Most of the people described in this video had no warning. They did not know a volcano was about to erupt. They did not know a plague was traveling toward them on a ship. They did not know the empire that organized their entire world was 2 seasons away from collapse. They woke up one morning into a reality that was completely different from the one they had gone to sleep in, and they had to deal with it with the bodies and minds and communities they had. You have something they did not have. You have the knowledge that it has always been survivable. Not always, not for everyone, but for enough that the chain never broke, for enough that you exist. The next time you feel like the world is falling apart, and it may well feel that way, because the world has always had the tendency to seem like it is falling apart. Remember this, humans have survived a supervolcano that nearly ended the species. They have survived civilizational collapse, centuries of plague, genocide, and world war. They have survived the complete erasure of entire ways of life and rebuilt. Sometimes within a single generation, something new. Not better, always. The losses were real, the grief was real. The people who did not survive are not statistics. They were people who deserved to live, who had names, who were loved, who wanted more time. Their absence is not a footnote. It is the cost of everything that came after. But you are the after. You are what they bought with everything they had. So go ahead, drink your cold coffee, sit in your traffic, live your ordinary, unremarkable, miraculous life, because the worst time in history to be born was not now. And the person who would have given anything to be born in a time as safe as yours, that person is somewhere in your past, in every past, looking forward through all the chaos and the darkness, hoping that something survives. Something did, you did, and that more than anything is the most extraordinary fact in all of human history.